Good evening. Thank you, Noah. As you mentioned, my name is Srđan Prodanović. I come from the Institute for Philosophy of Social Theory, and I will be the chair of this panel. Today, we will hear three very interesting lectures, and I think that we will have a nice debate afterwards. The name of the panel is called Celan today, and without further ado, I will give the word to Professor Michael Eskin from Upper West Side Philosophers Incorporated, USA. So, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I think that this one is yours.
Yeah, you can hear me. First, I would like to thank, following the predecessor, the Institute for Philosophy, the Center for Cultural Decontamination, and the Euro program for inviting me to be here today and for being so generous. I've never been to Belgrade, so it's a double treat. There's a common saying in New York City, a kind of mantra reminding us that we're all part of a responsible for a larger social and moral whole. You will sometimes see it on posters in subway cars or in billboards along public roads, or you might hear it in a recorded voice on the public address system, on the bus, subway, or train. If you see something, say something. As you have probably guessed, this phrase does not simply suggest that if you see, say, a pigeon in Central Park, you should say, "Look, a pigeon." What it means is that if you see something you believe requires attention or intervention, such as an act of violence in progress, you should say something. That is, you should actively work toward remediating what you see and thus actually do something. In other words, if you become a witness to something, you ought not to stop short of becoming an agent, which agency is already implied and manifested in your saying something. If you see something, say something, can thus be understood as a commandment, implying an ethics, a way of conducting oneself and living in society. There are two things about this phrase that I would like to highlight specifically. First, the underlying assumption that witnessing is, at its core, structurally unproblematic. That is, that it is a straightforward dynamic or event, and this is my second point, that it smoothly translates into action, be it through speech or other means. And this, by the way, if you see something, say something, harks back to the concept and practice of witnessing, operative, for instance, in the New Testament, as you mentioned as well, where the ability to witness, be it in concrete, historical, spiritual terms to Christ's presence, or in terms of Christ's own witnessing to his status as the divine made flesh, then killed and resurrected, is taken for granted in and of itself, and as in and of itself enjoining being translated into visible action, into a way of life. In other words, none of the conceptual difficulties presumably besetting the notion, practice, and very possibility of witnessing, signaled by a number of contemporary theorists against the foil of the Shoah and its aftermath, most notably Jacques Derrida, Shoshana Feldman, Dori Laub, and Giorgio Agamben, seem to complicate this quotidian view of testimony. Before I proceed, then, allow me briefly to head off a number of potential conceptual impasses. Among other observations on witnessing, Derrida, for instance, throws into relief two paradoxes that seem to put it into question in its very viability. The first has it that while testimony should remain unrelated to literature, understood primarily as fiction, there is no testimony that does not structurally imply in itself the possibility of fiction, lie, and perjury, that is to say, the possibility of literature, that innocently plays at perverting all of these distinctions. If this possibility that it seems to prohibit were effectively excluded, if testimony were thereby to become proof, information, or certainty, it would lose its function as testimony. In order to remain testimony, it must therefore allow itself to be parasitized by precisely what it excludes from its inner depths, the possibility of literature. If this sounds convoluted, it's because it's a direct quote from Derrida, and it was part of the invitation that I received. So I thought I'd take this as my point of departure. The problem here, in my view, is that this paradox is really specious. As an act of language, testimony neither has the freedom or power to allow or not allow itself to be haunted or parasitized by something it presumably excludes, nor could it even exist otherwise, thereby ceasing to exist as testimony. Witnessing evinces the same structural characteristics as any other verbal message, with its multiple linguistic functions, including the referential and the poetic, which may or may not dominate the message. In fact, Derrida himself suggests as much when he emphasizes that the effectiveness of testimony squarely hinges on a non-fiction agreement between witness and addressee. Derrida's second paradox pertains to testimony's presumed relation to time. And I quote again, "For to testify is, on the one hand, to do it at present. The witness must be present at the stand himself, without technical interposition. One must oneself be present, speak in the first person and in the present, and one must do this in order to testify to a present, to an indivisible moment at a certain point, to a moment assembled at the tip of an instantaneousness, which must resist division. For testimony, there must be the instant, and yet, on the other hand, this condition of possibility is destroyed by testimony itself. Ocular, auditory, tactile, any sensory perception of the witness must be an experience. As such, the constituting synthesis entails time and thus does not limit itself to the instant. The moment one is a witness and the moment one attests, bears witness, the instant one gives testimony, there must also be a temporal sequence." End quote. The problem here, in my view, is twofold. First, a minor point. Testimony can, in fact, be given via technical interposition and without the witness being present at the stand, as attested to by video testimony or written testimony in court and elsewhere. So there, Derrida is either simply wrong or intentionally polemical. Second, and more importantly, the ostensible condition of possibility of testimony adduced by Derrida, namely the existence of the indivisible instant, is deeply problematic in that it subscribes to a pseudo-Aristotelian notion of time, understood as a series of ever-evanescent, indivisible nouns, which, however, and ironically so, will have precisely always already been undermined by Derrida's own master concept of différence, squarely grounded as the latter is in Husserl's and Augustine's anti-Aristotelian view of time as a continuous protentive or anticipatory and retentive or commemorative spatio-temporal dynamic that renders the very issue of presence and the instant moot. Both as an act of language and an experience, testimony is essentially temporal. Thus, neither the alleged inherently literary character of testimony nor its putative reliance on the impossible instance have any bearing on the actual workings of testimony in real life, where, as Fellman and Laub, among others, point out, first-hand seeing and eyewitness testimony continue to play a central juridical and pragmatic historical evidentiary role, irrespective of the witness's reliability as far as the truth or moment of testimony are concerned. And I quote, "One does not have to possess or own the truth in order to effectively bear witness to it." Speech, in its very temporality, after all, Fellman stresses, is in and of itself unwittingly testimonial. Concomitantly, Fellman and Laub argue, with Paul Celan's lines, "Niemand zeugt für den Zeugen" in mind, no one bears to the witness. We've heard those lines repeated multiple times today. So concomitantly, they argue that witnessing is an essentially solitary and isolating act due to the witness's structurally singular place vis-à-vis him or herself as a witness, vis-à-vis the witnessed, and vis-à-vis his or her addressee. And that it thus imposes, and I quote, "the solitude of a responsibility and the responsibility precisely of that solitude. This essentially unshareable responsibility and solitude enjoined Fellman, this time by way of Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, and on the basis of the unwitnessed and unwitnessable because unsurvived event of perishing in the gas chambers, to speak of the impossibility of witnessing tout court. Something that Giorgio Agamben, in turn, elaborates and analyzes down to the last detail against the foil of Primo Levi's distinction between the true witness, the complete witness, the one who does not return from the gas chambers and live to tell about it, and the survivor witness who is thus ever doomed to, quote, bear witness to a missing testimony and in the name of the impossibility of bearing witness, unquote. But the question of witnessing, the possibility of bearing witness, does not necessarily need to be posed in light of the Shoah in order to be productively reflected upon and engaged in contexts where witnessing is key for doing justice to victims and holding perpetrators accountable. And let me stress right away that I'm not in any way aiming to belittle or downplay the sheer moral, political, historical, and human atrociousness of the Nazi or any other genocide. As far as the question of the possibility of or impossibility of witnessing is concerned, however, any death, we all recognize, is by definition unwitnessable, whether you die at home in your sleep or in the gas chamber. Which is why I would like to engage this question squarely on this side of death, on this side of the witnessable, where testimony in fact happens in one way or another all the time, helping us to work toward the good. Fully recognizing the sensitive and highly complex nature of the subject and practice of witnessing, as it has exemplarily been tackled in the widely influential work of the above thinkers, I wish to take a slightly different approach in what follows, neither endeavoring to further pursue their ostensible paradoxes and aporias, which I simply wish to have signaled, nor aiming at a facile kind of naivete concerning the question of testimony. With Primo Levi's warning about the danger of confusing conceptual simplification with the true complexity of reality in mind, I would like to quote Argentinian thinker Jorge Bucay by way of a methodological starting point. Quote, I'm fully aware that I sometimes dispense with differentiations. I believe one can live with that. If you simplify, you leave it up to the individual to complicate any given thought to the degree that fits the individual's mode of thinking. But if you complicate things too much, some might not be able to sufficiently simplify them, unquote. Thus, I'm asking for leniency in my attempt at a certain simplicity of argument, yet a simplicity, I hope, without simplification. Paul Celan's lines from the late and highly complex poem Aschenglorie, Niemand zeugt für den Zeugen, no one bears witness for the witness, have served as a leitmotif and an inspiration for much contemporary thinking about testimony. Given their poetic rather than declarative, apophantic character, however, that is, given that they are emphatically literature, given furthermore that it is not at all clear what Celan means by no one, a moniker he sometimes uses to refer to God, for instance, in which case the putative paradox of these lines dissipates. Given that at most they can be said to generate what Kant calls an aesthetic idea, which, quote, gives a lot of food for thought without being accompanied by adequate concepts such that no language can fully grasp and render it intelligible. Given all of these aspects, I would like to respect these lines' poeticity and not use them as a point of departure from my own discussion. This is not to say, however, that Celan's legacy isn't replete with testimony and continuous poetic reflection on it. After all, his entire oeuvre can be said to unfold as an extended act of witnessing to what he refers to as the thousand darknesses of what happened. How then can Celan's approach to and practice of witnessing through poetry be said to productively enrich our thinking about it beyond feeding into the above outlined theoretical impasses? I would like to begin from a different, less widely known statement by Celan, a true declarative statement, this one, that subtly broaches the question of witnessing. In a letter to German writer Hans Bender of May 18, 1960, Celan writes, Gedichte, das sind auch Geschenke, Geschenke an die Aufmerksamen, Schicksal mitführende Geschenke. Poems, these are also gifts. Gifts to or for the attentive ones, those who pay attention, who are considerate, who show great care. Aufmerksam is a multivalent term that I tried to detail in several translations. Gifts that carry fate, human fate or destiny with them. That is how Celan wishes his own poetry and its reception ideally to be understood. The key terms for our purposes are Geschenke, die Aufmerksamen, and Schicksal. So gifts, the attentive ones, those who pay attention, those who take great care, etc., and fate or destiny. Schicksal can mean both. As gifts, poems reach out to someone, they have an addressee. The latter, in turn, is someone who pays attention to what they have to say, with great care and consideration. And what they speak of, what they carry with them and contain, their content, is human fate, which those poems attest to, while testifying to their own role as purveyors and carriers of fate. In short, poems are witnesses that strive to themselves be witnessed by their recipients. Arguably, the most attentive, careful, and considerate artifacts of language, poems, Celan suggests, reach out to witnesses who would be equally considerate, attentive, and full of care. Why? To testify to human fate and destiny. Celan has seen something, and he has said something. Celan's witnessing has an explicit goal: to find the attentive, caring addressee whose Herzland, heartland, Celan's term, his poems might one day be washed up upon. Celan's witnessing is neither juridical, not having been subpoenaed or called to witness before a judge as part of a trial, for instance, nor is it historical as such, to the extent that Celan's poetry, and poetry more generally, is not history or historiography, as already Aristotle pointed out. Above all, Celan's, I would argue, is a moral kind of witnessing, and in that sense deeply judgmental and more or less implicitly accusatory. Quote, "We live under dark skies, and there are precious few human beings," he writes in the same letter to Hans Bender. "That is probably why there are so few poems," he continues. "My hopes, the ones I still have, are slim. I try to preserve what is left." Elsewhere, Celan notes in a famous passage, being essentially dialogical, the poem can be a message in a bottle, sent in the belief, certainly not always strong and hopeful, that someday, somewhere, it might wash upon land, heartland, perhaps. Celan's harsh judgment about the state of humanity, the state of the world and society, is unmistakable, and anything but positive or sanguine. Could it be, then, that as far as its testimonial function is concerned, above and beyond that is the question of calling, gift, self-therapy, and whatever else might be the cause or motivation underlying Celan's becoming or being a poet, could it be that Celan's poetry has a distinct mission to express his and our indignation, pain, and incredulity in the face of what happened, and to find attentive addressees who will listen? After all, in famously equating the poem with a Händedruck, a handshake, only true hands write true poems, according to Celan, which handshake never happens unintentionally, Celan clearly imputes an intention to his poetic endeavor, precisely to make landfall on heartland, to seek and find die Aufmerksamen, to whom, before whom he can testify, record, pass judgment, and with whom he can presumably share his pain, dismay, and indignation about what he has seen, witnessed, and now attests to in poetic form. just as he himself had supplied the heartland for Osip Mandelstam and his poetic message in a bottle to wash upon, so he hopes to find heartland that will receive his testimony. Much has been written about poetry's capacity to link the most concrete with the most universal, thereby achieving a level of significance, both historical and ethical, unparalleled by other discursive means, which might have been one of the reasons that impelled Adorno to evolve his initial anti-poetic post-Shoah stance and proclaim toward the end of his life that because eternal suffering has as much right to expression as a torch should have to scream, it may have been wrong to claim that no poem could be written after Auschwitz. And yet, there is something about the perceived impulse or intuition motivating Adorno's legendary claim that there may be something barbaric about writing a poem after Auschwitz that has always haunted me, especially as a critic and teacher. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that Adorno was or is right, or that I believe that it would be frivolous for poetry to be written in the face of atrocity, thereby flouting everyone from Voltaire to Sassoon to Mandelstam to Celan to Caroline Fourchet, to name only a few signposts in the modern tradition of the poetry of witness. What I am suggesting, though, is that it might be worthwhile revisiting Adorno's claim in light of what I'd like to call its fundamental ethical thrust, which I read as a sort of frustration, indignation, dismay, anger, or what have you, in view of the fact that after what happened, people still dared to write poems rather than presumably doing something else. For clearly, the verdict is neither a necessary corollary following from the dialectics under the sign of which Adorno saw history unfolding, nor has it ever been or will ever be historically accurate or true. On the contrary. Which brings me back to Celan and also myself as his reader, as one of the, as I would like to think, attentive ones he addresses. What can Celan's message in the bottle be said to have ethically achieved? What is expected of me as a recipient of Celan's message in the bottle? How does my reading, my writing about Celan ameliorate the world, contribute to enhancing humanity? For aren't these the questions I do have to emphatically ask myself when I read and reflect on Celan's oeuvre? Ought one to read Celan's severe and difficult texts without an ethical goal in mind? Might discussing, say, Death Fugue in the warmth and safety of a classroom or in one's own study on the Upper West Side have indeed something barbaric about it if it doesn't lead to some sort of tangible action or activism? In a way not entirely dissimilar to writing Death Fugue rather than lending and not just shaking a hand, as Adorno seems to imply. Unfairly harsh, impious, sacrilegious questions, perhaps, I know. But allow me to pose them nonetheless, if only for heuristic purposes, since when I see something, I say something. And I have seen it multiple times that I myself, as well as my colleagues and students, read Death Fugue and moved on to the next subject, or went on about our daily lives as if nothing had happened. How then can Celan's poetic witness be said to have made the world a better place, to use yet another popular expression? How can his poetic testimony be said to have helped the widow, the orphan, the destitute, to quote Emmanuel Levinas? How have I made the world a better place by reading, writing about, and teaching Celan? I wonder, and deep down, I sense the rumblings of a skepticism that I have thus far not been able to drown out. After decades of reading and writing about Celan, I still can't shake the feeling that even though his entire oeuvre is dedicated to the memory of the dead and reads as one extended lamentation, it might fundamentally, and most legitimately so I should add, orbit above all around his own many-layered suffering in view of the unspeakable and its aftermath, rather than tending to the wounds of the other. How effective, I can't help wondering, might Celan's poetic witness turn out to have been measured by the yardstick of the avowedly ethical thrust of his own poetics. In light, that is, of Celan's own perlocutionary intent, in light of his own avowed goal to be ethically effective as a poetic witness. Another German poet, also a Büchner Prize recipient, has recently surmised Celan's poetry might be, above all, for Kabbalists and cryptologists. Unquote. In a rare moment of true and poignant cross-historical moral agitation, Giorgio Agamben comments on Primo Levi's account of a soccer match played between members of the SS and members of the Sonderkommando during a work break at Auschwitz. This match might strike someone, Agamben writes, as a brief pause of humanity in the middle of infinite horror. I instead view this match, this moment of normalcy, as the true horror of the camp. For we can perhaps think that the massacres are over, even if here and there they are repeated, not so far away from us. But that match is never over. It continues as if uninterrupted. Hence the anguish and shame of the survivors, but also hence our shame, the shame of those who did not know the camps and yet, without knowing how, are spectators to that match, which repeats itself in every match in our stadiums, in every television broadcast, in the normalcy of everyday life. If we do not succeed in understanding that match, in stopping it, there will never be hope. Can Celan be said to have succeeded in stopping this match? Can I, as a reader, writer on, and teacher of Celan, be said to have succeeded in doing so by adding my own witness to his poetry? I personally can only think of one other writer of Celan's generation who presents an utterly different path to thinking through witnessing, and who has actually translated witnessing into agency beyond the discursive, who has both shaken the other's hand and literally lent a hand. And I believe that this writer's legacy offers an exemplary contrastive interpretive foil for our engagement with Celan and the major theories of witnessing to the formation of which his poetic testimony has contributed. And I cannot help wondering, as an aside, if gender may have played a role in her complete and, in my view, unconscionable exclusion from contemporary theory of testimony to which she has so much to contribute. Etty Hillesum thought of herself as a writer above all. My real talent is writing, she declares, and the only written work she has left us, her diary. Among other things, Hillesum's diary, written in Amsterdam under Nazi occupation in 1941 and 1942, is a testament to one human being's most arresting altruism. I want to be sent to every one of the camps that lie scattered all over Europe. I want to be at every front. I don't ever want to be what they call safe. I want to be there, right in the thick of what people call horror, Hillesum writes in the fall of 1942, having already volunteered to go to Westerbork labor and transit camp in the northeastern Netherlands to support those Jews who were being deported there. And when she receives an exemption from labor service in Germany, she asks the lawyer who informs her of it, "Am I expected to jump for joy? I don't want that scrap of paper for which most Jews would give their right arm. I don't want it in the least. So why should it happen? Should it have dropped into mine of all laps?" Born on January 15, 1914 in Middelburg, Hillesum spent her entire life in the Netherlands until her deportation to Auschwitz in September 1943, where she died 2 months later. In response to the Dutch capitulation to Germany in 1940 and the gradual implementation of anti-Semitic rule throughout the Netherlands, Hillesum realized that if I have one duty in these times, it is to bear witness. Her diary, which miraculously survived and was published in 1981, is an attempt to do justice to this testimonial mission. In her day-to-day record of and reflections on human joy and suffering, the memory of peacetime and the depredations of war, the gradual tightening of the noose around Dutch Jews, as well as the unspeakable horrors they must face, Dante's Inferno is a comic opera by comparison, she notes. Ours is the real hell. Hillesum also documents her own inner evolution from a student who always lived in anticipation, with the feeling that nothing I did was ever real, the real thing, that it was always a preparation for something else, something greater, more genuine. The evolution from this to a mature adult who lives here and now, this minute, this day, to the full. Between her first and last entries on March 9, 1941 and October 10, 1942 respectively, what begins as the diary of an ordinary 27-year-old girl, as she calls herself, will have morphed into one of the most poignant and metaphysically profound articulations of human existence. What Hillesum comes to realize in the course of her diary are two fundamental things. First, that she is like a small battlefield in which the problems of our time are being fought out, and that all one can hope for is to keep oneself humble and available, to allow oneself to be a battlefield, for the problems must be accommodated, have somewhere to struggle and come to rest, and we must put our inner space at their service and not run away. Second, that she must remain her own witness, marking well everything that happens in this world, never shutting her eyes to reality, and come to grips with these terrible times and try to find answers to the many questions they pose. For perhaps the answers will help not only myself, but also others. Her twofold recognition that she must keep herself available and somehow understand, or at least make some sense of these terrible times she is a witness to, does indeed yield an important answer, which in turn entails a mandate to act. The most fundamental question to be brought to bear on these terrible times, Hillesum suggests, is why? Why is this happening? The profoundly metaphysical answer she hazards, more of an assessment than a theodicy, is that God is simply not powerful enough to stop it. One thing, Hillesum writes, is becoming increasingly clear to me, that you cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves. That is all we can manage these days, and also all that really matters, that we safeguard that little piece of you, God, in ourselves, since there doesn't seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances, about our lives. You cannot help us, but we must help you to defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. And Hillesum's way of living up to this mandate, to help God, to help ourselves, is by way of what she calls surrender. You must learn to forego all personal desires and to surrender completely, she addresses herself. And surrender does not mean giving up the ghost, fading away with grief, but offering what little assistance I can wherever it has pleased God to place me. For Hillesum knows, as she writes, that her true existential gift, her great strength indeed, consists paradoxically in acting without doing. I have never been able to do anything, she avers. That is precisely in actively surrendering, in, quote, letting things take their course, and if need be, suffer. Volunteering to join her fellow Jews at Westerbork without being called up is a direct and poignant articulation of such altruistic surrender and availability, which allows her to be there and be there with and for others and suffer with them. They keep telling me that someone like me has a duty to go on into hiding. Hillesum ponders, because I have so many things to do in life, so much to give. But I know that whatever I may have to give to others, I can give it no matter where I am, here in the circle of my friends, or over there in a concentration camp. And it is sheer ignorance to think oneself too good to share the fate of the masses. Hilesum saw something, said something, and literally did something, and in doing so, endeavoring to stop that soccer match our government so urgently wants us to stop. If you see something, say something. But the saying must be a doing. What kind of doing will need to be decided by each of us individually in the given situation. But in order to be truly testimonial, the doing must, I would argue in conclusion, be fraught with risk. We must have skin in the game, lest we remain observers on the sidelines, bystanders. Celan and Hilesum may well be considered the compass points of the cartography of witnessing, allowing us to chart and probe its tasks, possibilities, and limits. The one, leaving us a substantial trove of poetic, at times barely comprehensible testimony. Primo Levi famously considered it the obscure babble or gasps of a dying man. The other, Hilesum, leaving us a slim diary as limpid and conspicuous as any message in the bottle can ever hope to be. The one killing himself out of despair about what he had seen, and perhaps about the inefficacy of his own witnessing to stop the match. The other lending both her hands and thus risking the ultimate sacrifice in the cause of stopping it. The world may need both. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this thought-provoking lecture. And now, since the discussion will be at the end of the panel, I will call our next speaker, Professor David Corey from University of Wisconsin, and his lecture will be titled "Duncan and Gedanken: Reading Celan in the 21st Century."
Thank you. And I also want to thank the Institute, the Center, and NOAA for her very generous and kind invitation to invite me here to this panel, and all of the speakers who've spoken already this morning on Celan. I wanted to start referencing something that's already been referenced, Celan's speech that he gave in the city of Bremen in 1958 upon acceptance of a literary prize. And that speech commenced by Celan noting the etymological similarities between the German words denken, to think, danken, to thank, and gedenken, to remember or to commemorate. While he offers his thanks to those who awarded him the prize, he also calls on us, ein ansprechbares Du, a dialogic partner, to think about and remember the Landschaft, which we heard about before, from where he comes, and then from the Bremen speech, the landscape of Martin Buber and of the many Hasidic stories, and the language, German, he used to find orientation, to explore, and to write. In this speech, he clearly situates himself as a poet and as a German-speaking Jew who has been stricken by, but yet is also seeking a reality that is only addressable in poetry. So in my talk, I'd like to explore the importance of Celan's poetry as a direct call to humanity to remember the horrors of the Holocaust and of the attempted destruction of the European Jewry. So very much in following what Michael just spoke about. From his translation of Alain René's screenplay, For Night and Fog, to his Bremen and Büchner Prize speeches in particular, Celan has pronounced the need to remember and bear witness to the past in order to prevent it from encroaching on the future. Despite his warning and calls to think and commemorate these crimes, we've begun seeing in the 21st century not only a rise in exclusionary nationalism, but a return toward forgetting and a vanquishing of our need for collective memory. From the centrist German writer Martin Walser's initial objections to Berlin's memorial to murdered Jews in Europe, now echoed by the right-wing populist parties such as the Alternative für Deutschland, to even left-leaning intellectuals like David Rieff and his influential work in praise of forgetting, there is a move toward a reevaluation of post-memory and a questioning of narratives of testimony and commemoration that keep the memory of the past alive. So in my talk, I would like to consider the value of reading Celan in the 21st century and the necessity of thought, denken, remembrance, Eingedenk, and testimony found in visual and textual documents of commemoration, Gedenken. In 1956, 2 years prior to his Bremen speech, Celan was approached to translate the commentary to Alain René's groundbreaking documentary Night and Fog, Nacht und Nebel, about the Holocaust in German concentration camps. The original text was written by Jean Carol, a Catholic who was persecuted for political reasons. And together, René and Carol set about to create a monument of remembrance for those who had died in the camps, and to condemn, as Carol has stated, quote, a system which did not respect the elementary rights of everyone to his own originality and particularity, end quote. The overarching theme of the film is the need to provide a testament for those who have forgotten or may one day forget. Celan's translation of the voiceover commentary, as I've argued elsewhere, emphasizes even more the necessity of remembrance and testimony in regard to the Holocaust. Both are themes central to his poetry, but whereas his poems and even his essays are notoriously dense and hermetic, Night and Fog, his only film project, develops these themes linguistically more clearly and poignantly than in most of his other works. In fact, Otto Lorenz has argued that the appeal for remembering the horrors of the Holocaust forms a central part of all of Celan's writings. This is a quote from Lorenz. The individual's remembrance of a time of horror and death, the poetic language that in its contour points to this time and its spared middle, the impetus of engagement that seeks to prevent a possible repetition of the historical occurrence, those are also obvious characteristics of Celan's works, end quote. In many ways, Nacht und Nebel is not only exemplary of Celan's work, but also contains one of the most direct, passionate pleas for remembrance and tolerance in all of his works. By combining allusion to his poems that deal most directly with the Holocaust and the experience of the Jews, his translation adds a referential basis not found in the original script or in the film's images. The most powerful plea is saved for the end of the text and the closing of the film, in which Carol warns against the possibility of the old concentration camp monster returning again. And this is a quote in English of the translation of René's and Carol's film script. Who is on the lookout from this strange tower to warn us of the coming of new executioners? Are their faces really different from our own? And there are those of us who sincerely look upon the ruins today as if the old concentration camp monster were dead and buried beneath the rubble. There are those who pretend to take hope again as the image fades, as though there were a cure for the plague of these camps. Those of us who pretend to believe that all of this happened only once at a certain time and a certain place, end quote. Carol's concern here is for reaching an understanding of and a coming to terms with the horrors of the concentration camps, the monster that may or may not be dead and buried. While new executioners may and can come, Carol warns that with the passage of time, and as these images fade, the danger increases that people may forget the atrocities that such ideologies wreaked, leading to a false hope that such horrors would not be repeated. Celan, on the other hand, makes a quite different plea in his translation of this passage, one much more indicting, but no less passionate. And this is an English translation of Celan's translation into German. Who among us is standing watch and warns when the new executioners come? Do they really have a face different from ours? And there is us, who, when looking at the rubble, sincerely believe that the racial mania is forever buried underneath there. Us, who see this image vanishing and act as if we were creating a new hope, as if we really believe that all that belongs only to one time and one country, end quote. Celan conspicuously adds the word Rassenwahn, racial mania, which was not in the original text. The original only mentions the concentration camp monster, as an indictment of those of us who believe that racial hatred and persecution are singular to one country and one era. Celan scholar and translator John Felsteiner has noted that Celan never used the word race, Rasse, in any of his poetry, and when he came upon the word in a French poem he was translating, he there too refused to translate it into the German word Rasse. Perhaps for Celan, the ugliness of the term was incongruent with the language of poetry. In his Bremen speech, for instance, he offered that the poem should be seen as, quote, a manifestation of language, and thus essentially dialogue that can be a message in a bottle, a Flaschenpost, sent out in the not always grateful, greatly hopeful belief that it may somewhere and sometime wash upon shore in the heartland, perhaps, exactly as Michael quoted before. Poetry, unlike speeches or essays, engages to start a conversation, which, so the hope goes, will serve as a Flaschenpost to bear witness of personal memory and experience, an apt metaphor for the role of the poet. Here again, Celan entreats us to think, denken, and remember, gedenken. Carroll concludes the film script with an appeal to remember the victims of the concentration camps, and admonishes us against looking away and forgetting, and thus becoming one of those who look around them, deaf to the endless cries. Celan again alters the text ever so slightly, so as to add a plea, not only the cries of the victims not be forgotten in silence, verstummt, but also the cry of the poet. For there is only us, those of us who have seen the images and been witness, and have seen them disappear, and those of us who pretend that it did not happen and don't hear that the cry is silenced. Within this appeal to us, the collective whole of humankind, Celan works with both the visual image, the Anblick, the image, the Bild, which we overlook and see disappear, as well as the auditory, the Schrei, the scream, which must not be silenced. Whereas in the original text, this cry was plural, crier, Celan has singularized this cry to suggest the cry of the poet, no longer merely a voice, a Stimme. The expression of the poet after the atrocities of the Holocaust has now become a cry which, despite our attempts not to listen, has not been silenced. Ironic is the fact that this silencing, as he reminds us in the Bremen speech, has occurred once before, in those years in which only language, die Sprache, survived. For Celan, the act of witnessing and testimony becomes a participatory act. In his 1958 poem Engführung, translated often as Stretto, Celan calls upon the reader to act, quote, read no more, look no more, go, suggesting, as John Felsteiner has argued, that, quote, mere reading and even witnessing won't do anymore, end quote. Rather, Celan beseeches us to move from passivity to action, to engage. As Michael G. Levine has argued in his study of Holocaust testimony, quote, to bear witness to the degrading and dehumanizing atrocities of the Holocaust is not simply to address one's story to others. It is more fundamentally to speak in search of an addressable you, echoing Celan's wording in the Bremen speech. The poem then becomes a testimonial act in and of itself, in search of a dialogue partner with whom it can engage in the act of thinking and remembrance. What might we learn then about remembrance, testimony, poetry, and justice by reading and considering Celan in the 21st century? The tragedy of the cry, never again, as Charles Villa Vincencio reminds us, is that it has failed to limit the capacity of human evil and prevent genocide in other times and other places. We continue to be confronted and confounded by the question of how to deal with and seek justice for the atrocities committed as a result of the Rassenwahn that plagues our world. Celan too confronted this issue and these questions and sought through words, dialogue, and poetry to come to terms with the complicity of those around him. One of Celan's better known and more widely analyzed poems, Totenauberg, which we heard this morning discussed, recounts, of course, a meeting in the Black Forest with Martin Heidegger. After giving a reading at the University of Freiburg, Heidegger invited Celan the following day to his cabin in the village of the same name. According to various accounts, Celan agreed to the invitation in the hopes of hearing a word from Heidegger about his past involvement with the National Socialist Party. According to Otto Pergler, Celan wrote in Heidegger's guest book a line later to be reconfigured in the poem he composed a week after the meeting. Into the hut book, looking at the well star, with hope for a coming word in the heart, he wrote. The word, an explanation, an apology, never came, and Celan left disappointed and deeply disturbed. In fact, the one-word line Wort in the poem he subsequently composed forms, as Mark M. Anderson has noted, the exact center of the poem, indicating the centrality of this poetic speech act for Celan. While critics have subsequently discussed and dissected Heidegger's political leanings, his failure to address his party loyalty, and to what degree his philosophy influenced Celan's writing, these debates have in some ways obscured the different significance of this encounter. Celan's consenting to meet with Heidegger in order to seek a word of contrition represents, I would argue, a move towards restorative justice, a process which has increasingly gained acceptance as a form of reconciliation in the wake of other post-Holocaust genocides. Theories of restorative justice emphasize three central tenets: repair, encounter, and transformation. While it is unclear what compelled Celan to meet Heidegger at his rural retreat, it is clear from his poetry that he understood the nature of the atrocities committed against European Jewry and the need for witness and testimony to repair those crimes. His attempted rapprochement with Heidegger, the desire to hear a word, or as we learned from the Meridian, his Büchner Prize speech, a counterword, ein Gegenwort, would have been a step, ein Schritt, towards acceptance, which can then become an act of liberation, Akt der Freiheit, as he mentions in the Büchner Prize speech, and transformation, the third and final phase of restorative justice. Tragically, this word, this step toward liberation and transformation, never came, and thus Celan was resigned to seeking redemption through poetry, his message in a bottle, which, with muted hope and expectations, might wash ashore in the future somewhere, someday, to testify and bear witness for future generations. But what of the legacy of this message in a bottle today? Germany has arguably more than any other country in the world undergone a deep coming to terms with its past, as revealed by the uniquely German term Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. From school curricula that emphasized the Shoah to Berlin's Jewish Museum and the memorial to the murdered Jews in Europe, Germany has, at least since the 1960s, confronted its past and its collective guilt by thinking and remembering, to the point that it has created, as Timothy Garton Ash has somewhat ironically and somewhat critically termed it, a German industry norm in dealing with the past. This has created both tensions within the Federal Republic, as well as amongst scholars and intellectuals of European Erinnerungskultur and Politik, the politics of remembering. Stuart Taberner has shown, for instance, that a young generation of writers, artists, and filmmakers in the Berlin Republic have sought a normalization of German culture and society, in which they are free to explore issues in literature and film that are not related to German history, its past, or the so-called German Sonderweg. While certainly not denying the Holocaust or Germany's past, these younger generations see themselves as far removed from the events, not complicit, and thus not compelled to analyze and commemorate these crimes of their forefathers and mothers. David Rieff, in his ambitious essay In Praise of Forgetting, makes a similar case for the value of forgetting as a way for nations to move beyond historical traumas. He suggests, for instance, that, quote, "The world does not have memories, nor do nations, nor do groups of people. Individuals remember, full stop," and end quote. Forgetfulness, both individual and collective, he argues, is inevitable, and in the end, quote, "Memory, even of radical evil, does nothing to protect societies from future instances of it," end quote. While he recognizes the need for a kind of Adornian minima moralia to keep us alert to moral nightmares like the Holocaust, history is too often deformed for nationalistic ends, and the ability to forget can, so his argument goes, allow countries to move on without being burdened by the past. Collective memory, he goes on to posit, has not brought about peace and reconciliation, nor has the failure to remember an injustice to a particular group been toxic to a given society. And his latter assertion, I would argue, is a bit more questionable. Thus, he wonders whether, despite the overwhelming consensus to the contrary, it might be justified to ask, quote, whether in some places, at some moments in history, what has ensured the health of societies and individuals alike has not been their capacity for remembering, but their ability to forget, end quote. This debate is certainly not new or unknown in Germany either, as increasingly groups on the right, and some even ostensibly on the left, have begun questioning whether Germany today should move beyond discussions and debates over its past and its collective guilt in order to join the world community as an equal partner. Others have made the case that in order to delegitimize the radical right, which seeks to view Germans as victims, German writers and intellectuals must concede these points and explore a counter-history, or simply stop focusing on Germany's collective guilt. One of the earliest and most prominent intellectuals to stake out this position was the celebrated German writer Martin Walser. Already in a 1965 essay entitled Our Auschwitz, Walser warns against the instrumentalization of the Holocaust and the media's detailed descriptions of the horrors of the concentration camps, arguing that such sensationalizing of the Holocaust has led many people to turn away from and reject the events in question. Walser's essay, it should be noted, was published during the Auschwitz trials from 1963 to 1965, and reflects an idea that he would develop further some 30 years later in a controversial speech he gave upon receiving the Peace Prize of the German booksellers in 1998. In that speech, Walser argues for relegating guilt and memory to one's individual conscience. Like Rieff, he worries that the public display of guilt and memory will be distorted for political gain, thus distorting the historical record. To make his point, he draws on a classic work of German literature, Heinrich von Kleist, The Prince of Hamburg, which he feels contains wonderful scenes, quote, in which the conscience is respected, perhaps even celebrated, as the epitome of the personal, end quote. Moreover, Walser asserts, quote, conscience, left to itself, creates enough illusion, but when it is commanded publicly, only illusion rules, end quote. Rieff concurs, arguing with Pierre Nora, that memory has become a substitute for history and has put the study of history in the service of memory. Thus, we have, quote, entered a world in which the essential function of collective memory is one of legitimizing a particular worldview and political and social agenda and delegitimizing those of one's ideological opponents, end quote. Somewhat ironically, Walser blames writers and intellectuals. Would the general public, he asks, really be poorer or coarser in conscience if poets and thinkers had not come forward as the guardians of national conscience? Rieff recognizes as well that at the end of the 21st century, there are few democratic societies that are not embroiled in their own memory wars. From Donald Trump to the Front National, the Alternative für Deutschland, the Party for Freedom, Jobbik, Golden Dawn, and the list goes on. We are witnessing a nationalistic, populist backlash to the remembrance and memorializing of the atrocities and tribal hatreds that defined the first half of the last century. Walser, in the aforementioned Peace Prize speech in 1998, caused a major uproar in Germany by proclaiming that he had become accustomed to looking away when confronted with what he feels are unbearable topics, like Auschwitz and the Holocaust. Without looking or thinking away, he would never make it through the day, he claimed. As such, he goes on to state, Holocaust monuments and memorials are nothing more than, quote, an unceasing presentation of Germany's national shame, end quote, whose motive is no longer keeping alive the memory or the impermissibility of forgetting, but rather the exploiting of Germany's disgrace for present purposes, end quote. To support his argument, he draws on two intellectual giants, Heidegger and Hegel, whose understanding of language, he says, is beyond question. For Heidegger, being guilty is part of being itself. Therefore, Walser concludes, everyone is alone with his or her conscience, and conscience cannot be delegated to the public sphere. Such an appeal for a retreat to the private, as opposed to a public remembrance, is the first step to clearing one's conscience of responsibility and relegating past crimes, as Carroll and Celan warned, to events that belong only to one time and one country. So finally, where does this then leave Celan's plea for remembering and thinking, and for the more poetic act as a message in a bottle for future generations? To be sure, Walser, like Rieff, has some valid concerns. A clear conscience is no conscience at all, he writes. He goes on to add, quote, for this reason, public acts of conscience are in danger of becoming symbolic, and nothing is more alien to conscience than symbolism, however well-intentioned, end quote. While the condemnation of Walser's speech in 1998 was swift and sustained, Ignaz Bubitz, the chairman of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, accused him of moral arson and repression, forgetting, and turning away from the Holocaust and Germany's responsibility. Walser's ideas have sadly now, 20 years later, become enshrined in the official platform of the Alternative for Germany. the right-wing populist party that will soon enter the Bundestag. In their 2016 platform for Germany, for instance, the AfD bemoans, quote, the restricting of Germany's culture of memory, Erinnerungskultur, to the period of National Socialism at the expense of a broader understanding of history that includes positive identity-forming aspects of German history, end quote. The AfD seem to share Walzer's self-proclaimed worldview as one of a potpourri of beauty. But here we must ask whether a nation's memory culture should be dedicated to beauty and positive identity-forming aspects of that history, or whether it is to challenge citizens to think and remember past injustices. And this, I would argue in conclusion, continues to be the role of the poet and intellectual, to engage in a dialogue and confront us with the reality of history as an object of memory. Remembering is an inconclusive exercise that continually addresses the question of atrocities and human rights abuses committed in the name of the nation-state. Thus, thinking, remembering, and commemoration are acts that must be paths to engaging in dialogue that leads to a construction of a national conscience and identity grounded in ethical principles. In the Meridian, Celan's celebrated Büchner Prize speech, he returns repeatedly to the paths upon which poems take us in search for a voice and a dialogue partner. And this is a quote from that speech. Is it on such paths that poems take us when we think of them? And are these paths only detours, as we heard before, detours from you to you? But they are, among how many others, the paths on which language becomes voice. They are encounters, paths from a voice to a listening you. End quote. While it is no doubt true that a word or a poem cannot change the world or the course of history, it can, however, engage in a dialogue and find a voice to compel us continually to think and remember, as well as to speak a truth to power in the hope of recognizing that racial hatred is a phenomenon that does not belong only to one time or one country. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now our third lecture will be given by Nina Čolović from Serb National Council, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of Zagreb, and Aneta Lalić, Department of Culture, Serb National Council from Croatia. It's titled On the Edge of the Text, Traumatic Disruptions in Language. So, okay, so.
We decided to split this lecture into parts. First part is going to be more theoretical. That's why I'm going to take this freedom that was offered to me to speak in my own language, so I can concentrate on my thought more than on the form itself. And the other part of the lecture is going to be more practical. My colleague is going to try to give you an insight. We are going to kind of start a little bit the topic that is going to be tomorrow, the topic of the post-Yugoslav conditions. So my colleague is going to speak about commemorative practices in Croatia, the way that these suppressed histories are trying to be put forward, put visible in the context of minority commemorative practices. So now I'm going to switch to Croatian. Znači ovako za početak ja bih se htjela pozabaviti uopće samim činom svjedočenja. Do sada smo se bavili Celanom koji je vezan uz određeni kontekst, doduše jako protočan kontekst koji u sebi nosi elemente njemačke kulture, njemačkog jezika, francuskog, različitih aspekata koji ulaze u konvergenciju, u nekakav splet jedni s drugima. Ali ako izmaknemo stvari i govorimo o svjedočenju primjerice na ovim prostorima, vidimo zapravo da se taj govorni čin ostvaruje u odnosu prema nekim drugim referentnim točkama, prema nekim drugim odnosima koji su kontekstno specifični. Znači, svjedočenje kao čin iznošenja nečeg što je proživljeno zapravo se konstantno hvata za određene vidljive i društveno prihvatljive konvencionalne momente. Znači, svjedočiti o tome što se zbilo u određenom trenutku znači nužno referirati na historijski kontekst, nešto što je prethodilo tome. Što vidimo na primjeru postjugoslavenskih prostora, znači u Hrvatskoj, svjedočiti o 90-ima, nužno za sobom povlači i trunke naslućivanja onog što je bilo desetljećima ranije u Drugom svjetskom ratu. Jedan od primjera je sama ratna propaganda 90-ih koja se pozivala na ustaše, četnike, na koncepte, konstrukte, subjekte koji su postojali u jednom drugom vremenu, u jednom drugom trenutku. Znači, jedan kontekst nužno evocira drugi. I tu zapravo kad se dotičemo same ideje subjekta ulazimo u to što znači zapravo ta subjektivizacija na području jezika, što to znači moći govoriti i to na više razina, što to znači primiti mikrofon u ruku i reći dogodilo se to i to i što to znači zapravo probiti se kroz jezik u tom trenutku. Ono na što želim uputiti da je stvar tu prilično kompleksna kad govorimo o jeziku i da ne govorimo o jednom kompaktnom homogenom fenomenu, već da prije kad bi govorili o jeziku trebali bismo misliti na nekakvu vrstu mreže u kojoj nalazimo koncentraciju, nahrupu određenih linija, niti znanja, pa i govorimo o različitim normama koji se nalaze unutar jednog jezika. Znači, postoji nešto što bismo rekli da je konvencionalan svakodnevni jezik koji čuva dominantno znanje koje je utkano u institucije države, u institucije koje su vezane uz administraciju, pravnu sferu, a s druge strane imamo i neke druge institucionalizirane jezike koji su vezani uz govor drugih subjekata poput nevladinih organizacija, poput grupa koje nisu mišljene u kontekstu institucionalnog. Znači imamo taj rastjep u subjektivizaciji. S jedne strane subjekt koje institucije prepoznaju i koji govori jezikom koje institucije razumiju i subjekt koji se ne uspijeva afirmirati kroz taj diskurs i koji traži zapravo alternativne načine izgradnje. Znači, to je ovo što zapravo možemo pratiti na ovom konkretnom primjeru koji će Janeta ucrtati. Znači, s jedne strane imamo komemorativni jezik države i s druge strane imamo komemorativni jezik pojedinih institucija koje predstavljaju stradale, koje predstavljaju ljude koji nisu komemorirani ni mišljeni kroz ovu dominantnu sferu. Znači, zapravo, raspravljajući o jeziku, zapravo raspravljamo o znanju. Što je to što znamo u nekom kontekstu i što je to što se može znati. Znači, što i kako će znanje o jeziku biti oblikovano, ovisit će o tome što njegovi govornici označe relevantnim u svijetu koji ih okružuje, ali hoće li to znanje biti nešto što će biti podignuto na višu razinu, ovisi zapravo o toj injekciji moći koju ona dobiva, koju dobiva u kontekstu institucionalnog. Zapravo sukob koji se tu postavlja između poetskog i nepoetskog jezika je zapravo sukob između svojevrsnog reda kojem institucionalno teži i potrebe da se taj red krši kako bi se pronašlo mjesto, kako bi se pronašla pozicija za one čije iskustvo je ugušeno, čije iskustvo je pritisnuto u tom redu i tim redom. I u traumi se zapravo razdiru procesi kojima se proizvodi ideja uređenosti, usustavljenosti stvarnosti, jer se stvarno zapravo prokazuje kao kaotična, kao nešto što je nemoguće zahvatiti, iako nas jezik uvjerava i drži u iluziji da vladamo njome. Znači da vladamo njome jer je možemo staviti u određene kategorije, u određene strukture. I te strukture i te kategorije postaju konkluzivne, postaju na neki način te koje pritišću govornike jer traže od njih da prodru unutra kako bi njihovo iskustvo bilo razumljivo drugima i kako bi iskustvo bilo razumljivo i njima samima, kako bi oni sami mogli steći kontrolu nad time što su proživjeli. Traumatska realnost su neizvanredna, nadilazi granice svakodnevnog iskustva u kojem komuniciramo i kojem razmišljamo i za koje je uopće konvencionalni institucionalni jezik mišljen. On zapravo pokušava izgraditi zajedništvo, pokušava dovesti različite ljude na nekom teritoriju zajedno. Ako gledamo dakle kroz ovaj kontekst s kojim se suočavamo ovdje gdje je jezik toliko isprepleten s nacionalnim i isprepleten s etničkim, a trauma zapravo prokazuje to zajedništvo kao hinjeno, kao nestvarno, kao nešto što je teško postići i što je upitno možemo li uopće postići. Znači, ako je jezik kolektivan i dijeljen, on je alat za izgradnju zajedništva, a svaka komunikacija pretpostavlja govornika i sugovornika te razmjenu među njima, primoravajući zapravo aktere na to da otvaraju prostor za reakciju drugog. I zajedničko znanje o svijetu je pretpostavka komunikacije i interakcije među njima. I ta organiziranost i uređenost stvarnosti ulijeva povjerenje, ulijeva zapravo spremnost ljudima da ulože napor prema suradnji, da ulože napor u komunikaciju, ta vjera da grade nešto i ta vjera da se kreću zajedno prema nekom zajedničkom cilju. Trauma je neizreciva jer prodor smrti, mogućnost povrede, emocionalne ili tjelesne, zapravo nagrize i kida tkivo suradnje u komunikaciji. Te zajedničko putanje koje bi iznjedrila zajednički jezik, razumijevanje. I ta suradnja je zapravo ugrožena samim time što je trauma nužno nešto disporično, nešto što je toliko opterećujuće i teško da bi ugrozila uopće interakciju među ljudima, stoga se trauma potiskuje kao nešto što bi zapravo raspršilo tu iluziju zajedništva. Ona je ulaz u ekstremnu nesigurnost, opasnu i prijeteću stvarnost u kojoj interakcija izvor boli i patnje. Ta međusobna upočenost govornika i sugovornika jednog na drugog u jeziku se preokreće u oprez, preokreće se u to da postavljaju granice jedan prema drugome, kreira sumnju, a pucanjem komunikacije puca jezik koji iz nje proizilazi. Također htjela bih ukazati na dvije stvari koje se tiču jezika samog, koje onemogućavaju i zapravo na neki način postavljaju pitanje je li moguće svjedočiti, je li uopće moguće o ičem govoriti i je li uopće moguće o ičem komunicirati, ne samo o traumi, nego recimo o bilo čemu što se tiče govornika samog, a to su njegova tendencija prema apstraktnosti i aproksimativnosti. Znači, ako krenemo od toga da jezik ne preslikava svijet, da on ne prati granice realnosti takve kakve jesu, da on nije otisak svijeta, nego da nužno selektira određene segmente svijeta koje zatim prerađuje, koje zatim pretvara u nešto drugo što ne korespondira s onim što je življeno, na taj način da to možemo stopiti jedno s drugim neproblematično i bez ostatka, onda zapravo vidimo da je jezik uvijek neka vrsta fikcije, da jezik je uvijek neka vrsta konstrukcije, ne samo kad govorimo o književnosti, nego kad govorimo i o svakodnevnici. Jezik se otkida od realnosti i u našem govoru zapravo se jako puno toga transformira u odnosu na esenciju toga što je proživljeno. Primjerice, govornik tijekom dana u svome tijelu je podložen nizu različitih osjeta i impulsa koji nisu svi verbalizirani. Nešto je izabrano, nešto je jezičnjeno, a nešto je ostavljeno iza nas. Tome ne pridavamo neku posebnu pažnju, neku posebnu pozornost, ali trauma to dovodi do krajnjih granica. Ona ukazuje u svom intenzitetu na tu krajnju raširenost, razdvojenost jezika od življene realnosti. Ona nas uočava s time da jezik zapravo zaista u svojoj srži ne reprezentira i ne može reprezentirati jer zapravo izgrađuje samo modele, izgrađuje samo nekakve projekcije stvarnosti i da mi uvijek u bilo kojoj situaciji samo raspolažemo s projekcijama. I te projekcije, da bi stvar bila još kompliciranija, su suštinski različite od grupe do grupe. Znači, ako se vratimo na to da je jezik zapravo mreža u kojoj je moguće zamisliti različite norme, tada smo, zapravo su te norme, te nagrupe nečeg što čitamo kao znanje, su u konfliktu, nisu kompatibilne nužno sa nekim drugim normama unutar istog jezika, odnosno ono što percipiramo kao isti jezik. Jer imamo konflikt u znanju, konflikt u povijesti, konflikt koji kreće i koji izvire iz jezika samog, jer jezik dopušta različite naracije istog događaja. Znači, i ovu samu konferenciju pri izlasku vani svatko od nas će možda prepričati iz različitog ugla, iako smo možda proživjeli isto iskustvo, ali ta istost u jeziku neće biti zadržana. Jezik će nužno povesti u različitim smjerovima. A paradoks traume leži u tome, ako se vratimo primjerice na ono što nas uče terapeuti, psiholozi, je što ona ne dopušta govorniku da se makne iz življenog, jer trauma je uvijek senzorička, ona je uvijek osjetilna, trauma je dodir, trauma je osjećaj udarca, trauma je ono što smo vidjeli, ono što smo čuli. A jezik uzima to što smo vidjeli i što smo čuli i onda trga od nas, odmiče od nas, baca daleko od nas. I zapravo ono što predlažem da poezija radi i ono što se meni čini da poezija radi je pokušava nas vratiti, pokušava to otrgnuto vratiti nama samima. Odnosno preokreće kolektivno prema pojedincu. I tu bi se naslonila na jednog možda već zaboravljenog, smatra nepravedno zaboravljenog teoretičara, estetičara Jana Mukažovskog, koji je postavio pitanje je li moguće promatrati konvencionalni, dominantni jezik proučavajući poeziju. Može li nama poezija, koja je zapravo toliko slobodna i toliko neuhvatljiva, reći nešto o normi, reći nešto o konvenciji? I on kaže da. Zašto? Zato da ako mi želimo razumjeti kršenja koje poezija radi, ako želimo razumjeti odmake koje poezija radi, mi to uvijek možemo razumjeti u odnosu na neku podlogu. Mi trebamo neko pozadinsko znanje da bismo razumjeli nešto kao neočekivano, kao kreativno, kao drugačije. U tome pomaku mi vidimo zapravo da nam poezija može služiti kao neka osnova za rekonstrukciju toga što je neizrečeno i za čime težimo u našem govoru, prema čemu idemo, što je to što nam je utrgnuto i što mi pokušavamo vratiti, na koje načine mi to vraćamo. Znači, poezija može čak po meni uputiti na neke obrasce, te strategije koje se u poeziji pojavljuju mogu uputiti na to kako konvencija funkcionira i što konvencija isključuje. Ako je pažljivo pratimo i ako je pažljivo osluškujemo. Sad je naravno opet pitanje šta to znači proučiti konvenciju i proučiti ostatak od konvencije proučavajući poeziju. Koja je to poezija koju bismo trebali uzeti u obzir? Je li kad govorimo o postjugoslavenskom kontekstu i kad govorimo o nacionalističkim težnjama i nasilju danas, koje crpe iz narativa iz 90-ih, iz Drugog svjetskog rata. Jel to znači da uzimamo poeziju ovog trenutka? Uzimamo li poeziju koja ide desetljećima i desetljećima natrag? Pa ja bih rekla zapravo da je to jedna neprekidna studija niti koja uvijek upućuje jedna na drugu, bez obzira gdje mi kronološki potegnemo granice. Ako i kažemo bavimo se poezijom 90-ih, od 91. do 95. Ona će uvijek u sebi nositi znanje prethodnih generacija, patnju prethodnih generacija. Jer ta mogućnost zaborava, koje smo se dotaknuli u prethodnom predavanju, zaborav je jezik ga koči, jer jezik zapravo čuva sve ono što je bilo. I poezija danas čuva sve ono što je zapisano prije tog trenutka kad je neka nego što je nastala u ovoj formi u kojoj čitamo danas. Tako da se sve veže, a jezik upravo time što drži kontinuitet nam omogućava da stanemo na ramena onih koji su se odupirali sličnim tendencijama nekad. Da vidimo zapravo po čemu je recimo Celanova poezija omogućila neku vrstu afirmacije, emancipacije i koliko toga preživljava u poetskom diskursu danas i ili recimo koliko odmaka od Celana postoji i zašto recimo se naslanjamo na nešto ili zašto se odmičemo od nešto, ili to stvar konteksta ili to stvar promjene tog znanja s kojim se hvatamo u koštac, ali svakako je poezija je izvor, moment rasvjetljavanja nečeg što konvencionalni jezik propušta ili ne želi osvijetliti. Znači, cijela moja teza bila bi da poezija može razotkriti mjesta na kojima se jezik raspada kad se pokušava rastvoriti za traumu i ukazati na načine na koje ga je moguće učiniti elastičnim, otpornim. Odnosno, te strategije koje su bile individualne i vezane uz poetski jezik možemo osloboditi i možemo iskoristiti za to da vidimo kako konvencionalni jezik destabilizirati, kako jezik svakodnevnice učiniti širim, kako ga učiniti takvim da može akomodirati one iskustva koje sada isključuje. Hvala.
Enjoying listening to Nina. Thank you. As Nina said, I will deal with the practical issues of the policy of remembering in Croatia. And our title is at the margins of text. So at the margins of text, but in the very heart of Croatian state-building context, we are faced with institutional, non-institutional, and extremely capillary informal mechanisms which maintain dogmatic attitude towards the war, 1991-1995. One of the most obvious institutional mechanisms of Croatian ethnicity democracy is certainly the Declaration of Homeland War, adopted by Croatian Parliament in 2000, which implies that there is only one interpretation of war and that all citizens believe only in this. Problem points of this declaration are numerous and certainly deserve socio-linguistic analysis, but I brought it up here today as one of the key points showing that Croatian language, estranged from its speakers, and this estrangement has been going on for 2 decades, is one of the best ways to control the so-called dignity of the homeland war. Informal mechanisms are many, and their diversity is painfully rich, especially in the area of linguistics, because it indicates capillary expansion of hate speech and simplicity of resorting to lynch within the network of regional, national radio and TV stations and portals. Places from which sermons are held are theological only style. So we can agree with philosopher Budin that there is a material reconstruction of church and spiritual revival of state, and that is a true origin of collapse of Croatian society. To analyze the possibility to recognize trauma in this context and outside its political use, it was necessary to define 2 types of time framework. One is the time of violence, time of war, time when myth-making thrives, which Professor Dejanovic discusses in his book War and Myth. And this is certainly a time of producing surplus trauma, which ends in the second phase, which we shall call in this work time of language violence or linguistic violence or maybe discursive violence. This is not so much post-war period as such, but the post-war period with delay effect. Myth makers are now using standardized myths to justify and sanctify each element of war. Language violence preserves and amalgamates unquestionableness of myths, and ultimately it carries an information about possibility of violence. After wartime and physical violence, language violence disciplines its speakers according to their social positions of power. At the bottom of this standardized chain of speech is the educational process, be it within the family or in the first grades of primary school. where uncertainty in the process of expressing oneself also reflects on the process of thinking as such. This is, of course, brief and rough outline of the Croatian political context. In its strategic and daily political center is primarily protection and continuation of values of homeland war. So instead of facing history in this time of linguistic violence, we have storytelling, and instead of individualization of human suffering, we are sanctifying an entire groups of people, national groups of people, as victims. On the other hand, responsibility for war crimes on part of the enemy is seen as a collective, and instead of anti-war education, we have gratefulness to war as the only mechanism of internal recognition. Of course, there were so many more, but they're not so interesting for the state-building memory. In the end, instead of remembrance of the civil victims of war and introduction of human suffering into public policies of Croatian society and Croatian laws, we have adoration of military victory and an absolute denial of social, political, and economic experience of Croatia within Yugoslavia. So who remembers and how? Who speaks in such a context? Who has a voice? Who is in the center of public discourse and who is on its margins? And what is happening with those whose war experience are unwanted? They do not need to be only members of Serb people, but also they can be civil victims of war from among Croatian people, or children from mixed marriages, or family members who fought on opposite sides. What with the experience which challenge and provoke sanctity of truth about war and the ethically pure victory? Where do these experiences end up and how to articulate them? Responses to this question can be pondered only from a perspective of current time of language, violence, or kind of eternal post-war period we are living in. For this matter, we will analyze practice and or politics of remembrance and state-building memory of the murder of Serb family Zec on the 7th December 1991, and on the other hand, the military police Operation Storm. Of course, there are many examples, but these two ones were very grateful for this analysis. This will bring us to two most typical modalities of state-building memory. We shall further emphasize the difference between commemorative acts as such versus artistic, in this matter poetic, questioning of historic events and human destinies with a thesis that the victims are fully given voice only in the field of art, while anything commemorative, even when it's activist, still speaks in the name of victims either by advocating their innocence or sanctifying their suffering for the needs of state. Murder of Zagreb family is moving in direction of oblivion, where language becomes estranged from the speaker or from the person who remembers the murder of a child. Remembrance of the 3 killed members of the Zec family and the experience of fear and life as refugees of the surviving 2 children was made almost impossible. This will become particularly obvious somewhat later from the state and society's reaction to activist and artistic practices and remembrance considering this unfortunate family. Lowering of voice is indicated when speaking about these victims in Zagreb. Language is due silenced because the speakers are either terrified or have become speechless. Murderers are free people and citizens, and one of them has even been decorated by the founder of independent Croatia, Franjo Tuđman. In 2016, and 25 years after the crime, Croatian Anti-Fascist League organized a commemorative gathering on the very location where Maria, and mother, and Alexandra, daughter, were killed. This is the place where killers, members of the reserve forces, first abducted and then brought the mother and daughter. They first killed the mother in front of the child and then fired 6 bullets to the head of the 12-year-old girl. They gathered Anti-Fascist League because they wanted to mark the place of a murder as a place of remembrance of the craziness of aggression, and ultimately as a place of facing not only the past but also their own fears, which perhaps rendered them speechless at the time of murder, but have now regained their power of speech. This made the commemoration truly significant and not only a formal protocolary gesture. Commemoration has to have transformational potential, otherwise it's not touching us in any sense. But even when commemoration is directed towards inclusion and questioning of social state and our own personal responsibility, it still does not open the possibility for victims to speak for themselves. As opposed to this commemorative act, and of course silence of the Zagreb city and the state, so as opposed to that, there is the field of art and performance which, in our opinion, returns humanity to those who were stripped of it, gives them back their human faces. The difference is that the artistic attempt is deeply individual, human act which, apart from exposing itself, includes vastness of human imagination and possibility of true empathy. One of the best examples is certainly Oliver Frljić's theater play, Aleksandra Zec, the name of the child, which, contrary to expectations of many, primarily focused on horrors which break, divide, and forever change perfectly orderly and predictable lives of the 5 members of Zec's family. The victim is given floor not only in the sphere of art. Memory is measured by her life and not by mindlessness of violence she had suffered, or the political exhaustion manifested either as a remembrance or forgetting and suppression. Director Oliver Frljić denounced the system of suppression of crime not just by allowing to the victim Aleksandra Zec to speak, but also by giving floor to her peers in this time of language violence to speak about their own experience with exclusivism in Croatia. The play is therefore not about who, where, and why first started with violence, but about whether theater is a possibility of putting an end to it and whether such a possibility is already integrated in the brave decision to direct and act in such a play. On the other hand, the Operation Storm, today that is a day of Homeland Thanksgiving, it is of course remembered very vocally with selected words from the podium, and the time of language violence is expressed in a language which is victorious, theologized, self-absorbed, and almost completely devoid of any regard of devastating consequence this had had, not only on the Serb population, but also on Croatia as such. By disappearance of people, their departure, destruction of their homeland, their languages at authentic localities also disappear. In the time of this discursive violence, institutionalized memory sanctifies victory and rejects any speech about looting and murders, and somehow encourages the atmosphere of hate speech against all who were ready to speak loud about all aspects of the summer 1995 in Croatia and ex-Yugoslavia. Almost simultaneously with the state-building ceremony, commemorative gatherings take place at some of the locations where crimes were committed against Serb population during the Operation Storm. These are also accompanied by certain rituals, such as religious rituals for the dead. Although there are no physical obstacles for these commemorations to be held, the number of people who come is small and media visibility only somewhat satisfactory. State lights are far from those who were killed and who, along with those who remember them, remain on the margins. And then again, an artistic gesture, intervention in a reality, brings a completely new quality which has already been discussed regarding the theater play. And it's about the same director. On the 20th anniversary of the Storm operation, and in cooperation with the activist, director Oliver Frljić and Croatian People's Theatre in Rijeka, organized a performance, Second War, in which 5 women of different nationalities, age, social class, and life experience in general spoke about their experience of war from the other gender's perspective. This was not so much about the play, but about how women with their full names and experience of fear for their lives, and with the experience of having faced death of their loved ones, with experience of losing home, with daily experience of discrimination in at least 3 post-Yugoslav states, therefore with all that were still courageous and decided to speak and be seen and heard on the very anniversary of their exodus and misfortune. In the time of language violence, this exceptionally brave gesture, as was the play, did not pass without protests, threats, physical violence, and finally a lynch against the director, which went on for the months. State building remembrance in strictly controlled Croatian language inscribed storm into its cornerstone. But thanks to brave commemorative acts on one, and brave but also creative artistic acts on the other side, everyone has the opportunity to see what and who is on the other side of this stone, the side deeply planted in the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina and Aneta. And now I would like to call all of the panelists to join me here for the part of the session where we will have questions and answers. And we have something like half an hour for the discussion. So yeah, I will just...
So thank you for your presentation, Michael. It was, I think it was an important contribution and generous gift. I feel personally, I feel a bit unworthy because I was probably not attentive enough. This is why I'd like you to elaborate on the thought of well, you mentioned that Derrida says that testimony is forever haunted by fiction and perjury. And I think, if I've understood correctly what Derrida writes, I think he means that, refers to the fact that testimony is never proof or demonstration. It doesn't furnish evidence in a strict sense. So this is why it's always debatable and always under suspicion. And this is why, for example, Holocaust denialists tend to doubt every testimony about the Shoah. And another thing is that, or linked to that, is that testimony is indeed a speech act. It's performative, and it requires, in response, it requires a sort of act of faith from the hearer, or from the court, let's say.
I mean, it's difficult. So there's a simple reading of Derrida that I tried to present, where with thinkers such as Derrida, at this level of intelligence and subtlety, I tend to always give him and thinkers of this ilk the benefit of the doubt. That is, he knows exactly what he's doing. And the two statements that I chose to focus on, one of which was quoted at length in the invitation to the symposium, obviously, I don't want to say contradict, but they're obviously belied by everything else I know of his writings. Beginning from the very early Derrida to the very late Derrida, a very simple question I would have asked him had I been present at his conference, in which he, in my imagining, would have elaborated this position, would have been, well, every act of language, by definition, contains its own counterfiction, because language as such contains at least two truths. The one that is being advocated semantically, and the other that is being presented surreptitiously, if you will, where language works against itself. I mean, the whole dynamic of deconstruction is such. So, in that sense, there's nothing special about testimony as a variety of linguistic activity that would make it, by definition, hollowed out, undermined, countervailed by what he refers to as literature. And he himself uses fiction as an example, as as the most exemplary form of that which is self-consciously and self-purportedly not true in any referential sense. So this is not specific to testimony. It's specific to any language according to the deconstructive view. And that is as far as I would go, as far as Derrida is concerned. However, I do believe, and that is my sense in general about Derrida, the early Derrida and the late Derrida, in a sense, he wants to have his cake and eat it too. So, while deconstructing the notion of presence, of truth, of all structural terms that enable structures while not being affected by them. For instance, in L'écriture et la différence, the final essay, Structure and Play in the Discourse of Human Sciences, if we take that as the prototypical programmatic essay, he still believes that there is, let's put it this way, a right and a wrong. Especially the late Derrida believes that. If you look at his reading of Patočka, if you look, were you the one who quoted tout autre, tout autre? Was someone? Yes. So I mean, in those essays, after his so-called ethical turn, if we can call it that, there's clearly a notion of unequivocal right and wrong. If I feed my cat, his example, I don't feed all of the other cats. Now, I never agreed with this argument, but he does present an argument for valid ethical truth. In that sense, there might be a version of Derrida in which testimony is not undermined by the fraughtness of language at all, where the witness actually does speak a certain kind of truth that is not necessarily fictional. I'm not sure whether I answered the question, but it was my attempt.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everyone. That was really interesting. And something that came into my mind that seemed to be relevant to all of you was about how distant does the account have to be from the event itself. It seemed that it was implicit in what Nina and Agneta, what both of you were talking about. I wrote down the phrase, you have to move away in order to reflect back on the event itself. And it seemed to be implicit in the play that you mentioned, that it was an anniversary and there had to be a gap. And obviously with the Night and Fog, that's 10 years later, and then Celan's translation was later again. And I wondered if that was an answer to move on to what Mike was talking about, why a diary can't be a testimony.
Why? What cannot be a testimony?
A diary. Because in all the other cases, there was a significant gap in a time of retrospection, whereas if you're in the midst of the events, maybe you can't call the account a testimony. So I wondered what you all thought about that.
Mine?
Which one?
You.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but there is a big problem, at least in Croatia, but I would say in post-Yugoslav republics. We have Holocaust denial is using different testimonies from the same persons from the Second World War during the time. So I'm not sure, are there any anthropological researches about explaining what is changing in someone's mind? Because we have one testimony after something bad, trauma had happened. Then after the war, 1945, we had slightly different story after the victory. And then 1991, that same person that was haunted by fascists is now again in a situation of trauma. And when he remembers this trauma from the Second World War, it's so much different. And we can track it through the time. So there are
obviously psychological explanations, biological, psychological, but it's a great, unfortunately, great argument for those who are either negotiating about the character of the Second World War in Croatia, or they are denying the genocide and Holocaust itself. So it's not, I mean, there we have a gap of understanding someone's mind and dealing with trauma through the time, and of course always in a different social political context. And if we are speaking again in a time of war, then it changes a lot. I'm not sure if I have answered, but that's what have occurred in my mind when you asked the question about distance. So distance can be
I think that distance is always there. It kind of draws what I was talking about, a modularity of language. Language creates models, and when you create a model of something, you need to distance yourself because you are not taking everything into account. When I'm narrating a certain experience, I'm not going to say everything about it. Not every sensation, not every impulse, not everything that I saw, that I heard, but I will select something that I found relevant as a person that was experiencing something. So I'm gonna put something outside, I'm gonna leave something, not because I'm lying or because I'm giving a false account, but it's something that language makes us do. It's compulsory. It makes you have something simplified versions of reality.
and less painful.
And less painful, yes, because language makes these little doses that we can bear of experience. It can take trauma in its entirety because it's so intense. It's such a burden for the communication, for that contact between speakers that just takes little bits. I was talking earlier about the notion of pain, for example. If I get hurt on a paper, I cut myself on a paper, I can say I feel pain. But people who are testifying about concentration camps are also going to use that word, going to use the word pain. And you see, language makes you take one category and put in it all these different kinds of experiences to equivalize different kinds of experiences. And that is also a way language is violent towards a person who is speaking. Because if I want to testify about Auschwitz, about Jasenovac, and I use the same word, it's kind of a language makes everything, neutralizes everything and rationalizes everything, and that is the danger of language, because I see it as a danger because language wants to present itself, language presents itself as something objective, as something, as a common sense, something that we don't need to deal with, and then we are going to take that common sense, what is language, and make a narrative with it. And we are not going to problematize the tool, because the tool is neutral in itself. But the problem is, it isn't. It never was. The tool is already conflicted inside itself. It already brings a lot of ideological threads that question each other, that push each other away. So we are taking something so messy as language, and we kind of, as a society, say yes, this is going to be something we are going to arrange and structure our reality with, but we do not return to that messiness, and I think that we need to return to that messiness, to the messiness of language.
I think your question contained a general question and a question about the possibility of witnessing insofar as it pertains to the genre of the diary. So the transcendental aspect of your question, is it possible to speak of testimony and witnessing in case of diaries in general? My answer would be yes, unequivocally so, for two reasons. One, we have at least one diarist who specifically calls what she's doing in that diary witnessing. We might not agree with it, but to the extent that we agree that she uses a word the meaning of which she's very much aware of, we have to accept that for her, writing a diary is a form of witnessing. But more generally, I would say that if I'm not mistaken, and let's assume you imply that the answer should be no to your own question. Let's assume that. The presumption there seems to be that there's something comprehensive, a totality, that can be witnessed to ex post facto, so to speak, with a certain temporal distance to this total event itself. So let's use the moniker Auschwitz, or any kind of moniker, comprehensive term that allows us to have a grasp on a historical reality that was very complex, temporally distended, and thus, by definition, not subject to limits. So where do you start saying this is where this witnessable event ends as a historical dynamic and becomes this event that we can witness? And where does the time of witnessing start? So I would probably suggest viewing witnessing as a continuously unfolding activity that comes in all kinds of forms, both linguistic, generic, and that never begins or ends, because time is continuous. So yes, you can witness in any shape or form while you're amidst, in the thick of it, and you're always in the thick of it, because until you die, you're in the thick of something, right? So yes, you can, to quote Obama.
I think I don't know if, does this work as well?
This one.
This one, okay. With regards to Night and Fog, and continuing on this idea of a continual, ongoing process, that what the film did was it really articulated the desire for a dialogue, for what Celan refers to as the addressable you. That we talked and heard a lot this morning about the I, the you, and the we. And I think that it really, in his film translation, comes out this desire for a dialogic process, which is a central act to remembering. That the issue of that Derrida talks about the unreliability, perhaps, of the witnessing act, and the things that we heard about of falsification, plagiarism that calls these things into question, is certainly there in that it needs to be remembered, it needs to be discussed. There has to be an addressable you, a person who's willing to listen in order to engage in a thought process about these particular events, to avoid just the summarily dismissing of the veracity of a particular act in some ways. And that the film really, at its closing, is very much forward-looking, whereas we've talked and heard a lot about the importance of the presence in Celan, which is very true. There are also things in which he talks this message in a bottle, the Flaschenpost, the Night and Fog translation, in where he's looking at future generations and desiring a dialogue with generations to come, as opposed to being explicitly focused on the present.
Any more questions, comments?
Risk, Michael. At the end, you had the question, you had the risk. Can you say something about the risk in Hebrew? What is the risk in Hebrew? How you translate risk?
Well, I think we have, what is the risk? The risk is that we have here a special guest that will give a lecture. I don't know where he is, Marzuk here. Who speaks both Arabic and Hebrew. And that's part of...
Risky.
Well, the risk is that we all the time talked about the Holocaust here, and also, but looking at in what sense the Holocaust testimonies are used in Israel today is also risky.
And the word word risk.
סיכון.
Yeah.
Да?
And the roots.
וסיכון.
Remember.
סמך כף נון. Да?
And because testimony, if it is testimony, is always
Да,
connected with the risk.
yes,
To the risk,
but
yeah?
עדות וסיכון הם עובד.
How you explain, Michael, the status of risk? Because if it is, testimony is always risky. You said risk.
One of the reasons why I thought that, everything we do is I'll go out on a limb. Let's assume that everything we do is personal, especially at this conference. We might be speaking theoretically about all kinds of things, but ultimately we wouldn't be here if we thought that it's really important to me individually to talk about this, one way or another. So we do expose ourselves in the same way that Celan claims that poetry does. It exposes itself and it imposes itself. So if you become an armchair witness, let me give you an example. When 9/11 happened in 2001, I was living 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. And on my way to work, it happened. I saw it, I was there, I ran, and other people did too. And then I went up to Colombia, and people were shocked, as they should have been, and nothing even happened to me, right? So I wasn't even a real victim of the situation compared to others. But in the months that followed, and I'll be very general, probably dangerously so, all of a sudden, a majority of, let's call it the American people, became victims of an assault or something that happened to each and every one. And it occurred to me, on a personal level, I had many arguments with people, especially academics, who sometimes think that they analyze world events better than others because they're educated, etc., etc. Sometimes. But I'm not being facetious. It was a very serious moment in world history. And yet there were distinctions of suffering, distinctions of risks having been taken. And there were many people to whom nothing had happened, who were in New Jersey at the time, or in Minnesota, who felt like victims. And yes, they were at a certain level. But then if you get to the nitty-gritty, they really weren't. They hadn't lost anyone. And they all articulated themselves. This was pre-blogging and pre-tweeting and pre-Instagram. But everyone had something to say about this. And yet there were people who, when they spoke about it, had more of an investment than others. So if you think about someone who is standing, let's say, to lose their job, like being very concrete about it, if you say something, your position is more risk-fraught than someone who doesn't stand to lose anything if they say something about it. So when I speak about this with Celan and Hillesum in mind, and it is a painful thing to say, and it is really, if I were a German academic, this would be the end of my German academic career, probably, if I said this. But I do think that for all the dangers and the horrors that Celan underwent as a person, labor camp, losing his parents, not having been there when they were deported, everything that happened to him, it's horrific. Horrific enough. Horrific enough. When he wrote as a poet in France, there came a point, and that's my personal reading of his trajectory. There came a point when when no risk were longer involved. Really risk of putting his life on the line, other than being an authentic, serious, strong poet, who with every line that he wrote, puts his life on the line. But there was no risk of punishment, no risk of retribution, no risk of anything. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, one could argue that just heuristically, if one wanted to make a case for a strong form of witnessing, then there has to be some danger involved for you to be a strong witness, let's call it that. So there are many other forms of witnessing, but the strong witness is the one who actually stands up even though he knows he will be fired. So that's what I mean by risk. Really an everyday notion of risk, some form of risk. And I think that's important to witnessing.
So the question is to build on what you just said. And I would like to comment because I cannot make sense out of this new phenomena. So the testimonies in Argentina that emerged after 70s and 80s in dirty wars were actually using some of the theoretical framework and paradigm that was built in the Holocaust. But something happened recently that is actually different kind of phenomena that puzzles academics because they do not know how to gauge that. And that is that the perpetrators have started giving testimonies. So what do we do with that? How do we approach that?
I think we would all be qualified. Since you're looking at me, I'm going to respond first. Being Jewish, having lost one side of my family to the Holocaust, the other to, well, a distant, long ago side of my family, obviously. The other side to Stalin, having had a grandmother who was a Stalinist judge who sentenced others to death, and being married to a German, I have no problem at all acknowledging that not everyone belonging to the group that has been pegged as the perpetrators was not also a victim of some sort. Which means that, so that's why I mentioned the biographical background. When Germans, it wouldn't be expected of someone like me, I guess, to be dismayed at the fact that some Germans dared to present themselves as victims who also suffered during the Third Reich. But it is the truth. The women who were in the bomb shelters when bombs fell on Dresden did suffer. The children saw, they went up in flames. So I think that acknowledging, it's not one or the other. There's a kind of, medieval notion of being spontaneously on your own side or on somebody else's side. So this notion of spontaneousness, where you don't, in a very Levinasian way, you don't approach the other with a preconceived notion that you are the perpetrator. Your relatives might have been, you may have been a perpetrator, so you'll be punished for that, right? But being a victim and being a perpetrator are not necessarily always clearly distinguishable in the same person. We're talking during lunch about it as well. Again, speaking as a Jew, there were Jews who were perpetrators as well. They were more victims than perpetrators, but they were Jews who didn't help other Jews. And before they went into the ghettos and the camps, they were Jews who saw Jewish neighbors being deported. They didn't say anything. No, they were complicit. So I think it's a very complex issue, and I believe that I'm not a politician, and thank God I don't have to make policy. But on an abstract level, the clear-cut distinction between victim and perpetrator makes sense to a certain extent, where it's clear who did something to whom. But then there's also a very, very broad swath of human reality where the boundaries are really very, very porous and permeable. And then when you go into succeeding generations, there it really becomes murky. And so I don't know, but I think it's not that easy to separate or to exculpate one or the other at all times. So I don't know.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Michael and David. I was reminded of it because you mentioned Primo Levi, and you mentioned Agamben and the distinction in witnessing that he does. But what escapes in Agamben and in many writings about witnessing is what Primo Levi says that I'm now citing from memory, but he says that the best historians of the camps were the anti-fascists or the communists, because they were political prisoners. They were better fed, of course. They were had better conditions. They were in better position to see something, and because they were politically literate and knew that their testimony would be political. The testimony itself is a political act. And it's interesting because when he refers to Jewish people, he talks about witnesses. When he refers to the anti-fascists, he talks about historians. But what is also interesting is that he makes a distinction in witnessing between giving a report about your own suffering and giving a report about the machine that created this. And one he relates to as political, the other he relates to as witness. And for me it's interesting because a few months ago I interviewed the victim of Omarska camp in Bosnia. And the woman I was witnessing, Nusret, she gave also testimony in The Hague. She was a judge before in Sefer. And after the interview, we just sat and talked, and she was saying how I asked her if she sees her testimony as political, and she says no, and she refers to party politics, not to political in general. But she totally divided the issues like truth, war crimes, dignity from the political. And I think this is one of the problems today that we are facing, in the sense of, and you know, this I was reminded of it because the example of Etty Hillsong as the counter of Celan. But that's certain kind of activism. But it's not a political activism, you can say. And it doesn't, you know, what is the difference between these two kinds of activism, and do you prescribe to one or the other as an, like, is there more ethics and kind of giving up to destiny, let's say, than there is to political activism as such? About how effective it is, we can talk later, but the act itself. And the second thing I wanted to ask, referring to what you said now, Michael, is, you know, Primo Levi, Celan, and Aberi committed suicide. And they committed suicide exactly at that point where witnessing didn't function anymore. And I also think that it has a wider political context, not just there was a shift in the whole paradigm of commemoration in the 70s. So it's not a coincidence that it's exactly after this neoliberal shift, and it's parallel in commemoration, parallel change in commemoration, which Samuel Moyle speaks about, that they committed suicide. So I think this moment you observe between the early and late Celan is very crucial.
Would you like me to speak to this?
If you
So, this was a very complex intervention. I would respond by, dividing into three compartments. One, I think that it's probably productive to distinguish between witnessing and documenting. So, documentation can happen in reference to the machinery that helps create or abets a certain environment in which things happen. And documenting you can do without necessarily building a personal narrative, I guess. That's how I would put it. Whereas witnessing involves more of a personal element that puts a spin that is more subjective. But heuristically speaking, maybe that's a distinction one could make. So, historical documentation becomes witnessing the way we understand it when you put something recognizably stylistically yours on the documentation. Hence, art becomes maybe an exemplary mode of doing it. To the ethics and politics question, I guess that would depend on your persuasion, your philosophical persuasion. So, if you are a Levinasian, you would strictly separate the two. Politics being totalizing, ethics being singularizing, and ethics by definition subverting the political. If you're an Aristotelian, you would always already agree that ethics is part of the mastercraft of politics. So that really depends on how you define the two. And in terms of the suicide question, I mean, I would never dare to pontificate on why they committed suicide. But in a parallel world, let's assume this is all the narrative we can talk about. And there is a narrative that, so I have to preface this, I'm really not adjudicating on Celan's suicide or Levi's suicide, but we're speaking fictionally now, right? This is a fiction. And presumably, there would be psychologists and therapists who would say, in this fiction, the most rewarding thing that will beautify your own life and make you happier would be helping others. So if you feel desperate, go out and do something for someone else, and maybe you'll feel better about the world and yourself. Now again, I've never met Celan, I've only read his work, and I know it very well, and I have never been able to shake a sense, especially the late Celan, not the early Celan. So somewhere I would even say after Niemandsrose, beginning with Atemwende and the poems written after the Niemandsrose. Basically when he started moving away from Mandelstam a little more, if you can say that. I read him as becoming more and more self-centered and cutting himself off from his readers and accessibility. And that's just a literary statement, not a personal statement. So in that sense, if I were Roman Jakobson, I could probably make a structuralist argument that in the same way that Mayakovsky's suicide was a logical conclusion of his move away from metonymy to metaphor, Jakobson probably would have made the same argument for Celan. His suicide was a logical conclusion of his move away from metonymy to metaphor. Understood the way Jakobson understands it. So there must be, if you make that argument. But of course, existentially speaking, there are reasons why they committed these acts. So.
Just very briefly, the only thing that I would add about your question of the political prisoners and communists being the best chroniclers, this was exactly the criticism that was initially made of Night and Fog when it was released, was that someone said quite famously that it was a documentary about the Holocaust that omitted the Holocaust because there was a lack of a specifically Jewish voice in the film. So Celan's translation in many ways infuses the film and the text with a singular Jewish voice that was absent from the initial release and construction of the film. So I guess it would be a question of what exactly was being commemorated or documented, as you said, making a distinction between witnessing and testimony. And this gets, of course, to the heart of the so-called German historians' debate over the unique nature of the Holocaust. Was this attempt by René and Carol to document, as you said, the machinery that produced the final solution? Or was it about a testimony specifically and singularly to the attempted annihilation of European Jewry? And so Celan's voice added to that amplifies the text itself and perhaps the goal of the film, which was lacking initially. And I think that the passage that I quoted where he talks about racial mania, which he added to the text, whereas Carol originally talked, as you said, about the machinery of the concentration camp monster, sets off then perhaps this more ethical versus a structural or organizational type of critique in the film.
Okay, thank you all. Unfortunately, we are out of time and we have to end the discussion here. I invite you all to join us at 6 p.m. to witness the exhibition opening titled Testimony to Politics at Gallery Allega Princes.
In 10 minutes there will be transportation.
Okay, thank you.